In the main House of M story, we saw the Avengers gathering heroes from the old world to fight against Magnus, but Captain America was not one of them. So what was his story? Welcome to Comicstorian, where we take single issues and trade paperbacks and break them down into digestible bites to help you understand. Then we read them dramatically back to you. All alterations to the panels, text, and images are to prevent copyright problems, and all art is owned by its respective companies. Steve Rogers, Captain America, fought in World War II, was frozen in ice, and then found himself in the modern day as young as he was when he was first frozen. So why did we see an old man in House of M? Well, today, I'm going to tell you his story. As the Veterans Hall in New York sits half empty, an old Steve Rogers says he really shouldn't be too surprised. What was it that his ex-wife used to say? You got everything you ever wanted. If the world didn't turn out how you thought it would, well, that's just life. Welcome to it. And that's just it. It wasn't how the world turned out that is the issue. It's how the world sees him. He is old, forgotten, and now he is sitting in a room with no more than 24 people talking about old war stories. He and Bucky used to have many adventures. They'd risk their lives every single day to protect their home. They would fight Nazis, take down Baron Zemo, and help bring down the Berlin Wall. There were others too, and he isn't one to take all the credit. Red Skull was killed, Adolf Hitler was captured. It was a different time back then. People celebrated his triumphs. It was in the early 50s when things started changing. The Senate questioned him on his relation to Namor, since Namor was also a part of the handful of people who helped him in the war. When mutant kind started to take over, the Senate wanted information about Namor, along with Toro, the Human Torch. But Steve refused. Those were his friends. He had nothing to tell the panel that they didn't already know, and so he resigned. A few years later, he'd be one of the first men to walk on the moon. And when he came out of the capsule, he was asked to say something newsworthy. So he thought for a moment and then stepped out. This is one small step for man, one giant leap for peace between man and mutant kind. It wasn't received well. But the bad things didn't just end there. Soon after that, his wife Peggy would leave him, upset that the choices he'd been making were embarrassing enough. But being a mutant rights activist? So he turned to the one person left, Bucky Barnes. But he too was concerned. He spoke that the mutants' rights groups were effectively terrorists. And sure, terrorists isn't an exclusive term to mutants, except with these mutants, they don't plant bombs. They are bombs. Decades would pass, but those words stayed with Steve. The mutant issue wasn't black or white. It was about politics and prejudice and fear. It was about shades of gray. While he spoke for equal rights for all people, regardless of race, creed, color, or genetics, he watched as the world changed. The mutant population explosion became something undeniable. Regardless of how mankind felt, it was clear that they would soon be the minority. And in this period of change, one mutant rose to prominence: Magnus. After Magnus's destruction of the Sentinel program in the early 70s, the rushing tide finally took over. Magnus was suddenly spoken of as a world leader. He was meeting with the United Nations and discussing ideas. Maybe it was the stubborn old warhorse in him, but Magnus's visions of the future, his ideas for peace, they didn't sit well with him. And perhaps foolishly, he said so. He was very outspoken about his worries that the leaders were falling in line to agree with Magnus, that he himself had no ill will towards mutants, but he was a man who judged someone by their deeds and their words. It also didn't help that when he was talking about the topic of things people say, he compared many of Magnus's statements to be on par with men like Mussolini, Stalin, and men like Hitler. It wasn't surprising that he was then forced into an early retirement after that speech. Turns out that Magnus had already gotten much farther inside the system than anyone realized, and dissent was not going to be tolerated. Time went by, fast, and in the coming years, Bucky would die in the line of duty working for S.H.I.E.L.D., and he wasn't even allowed to speak at the funeral. They never even told him the circumstances of his death, though it seemed clear that it had something to do with a S.H.I.E.L.D. op on Genosha. Now, it's been 50 years since that day he walked on the moon, and he is still thinking about Peggy, wondering what she'd think of this dinner party they threw for him. What can he say? He captured Adolf Hitler in his bunker with his own 2 hands. He walked on the moon, and in the end, there's not much more to do than thank the people who walked beside him, those who triumphed, and those who fell. All the rest are just leaves scattered on the winds of history, a history of a world that no longer exists, that's no longer relevant. As Steve walks down into the subway, a group of kids, mutants, come running through, nearly knocking him over. Steve balled his fist, but just picked up his hat and got on the train. It's hard to believe that this is the world that they fought for, that this is the world that Bucky and so many others died for, a world where humans have been pushed aside for mutants. It sounds naive to say it, but it doesn't seem fair. You really just never know how life will go. He could have died 100 times in the war, but instead, he lived. He captured Hitler with his own 2 hands, and then he got to walk on the moon 10 years later. Guess that's not too shabby, right? What was it Peggy used to say? You got everything you ever wanted. If the world didn't turn out how he thought it would be, well, that's just life. Steve laughs to himself, thinking back, and says, still, he thought it would be a lot different than this. And that is the short story of what happened to Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, during the House of M event. And I'm sure now you can see why the Avengers didn't give him his memories back and ask him to fight alongside them when they fought against the House of Magnus. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and if you did, please be sure to give it a like, leave a comment down below, subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon if you want to get notifications. And if you want to support us even more, you can go over to Patreon at patreon.com/Comicstorian, where for $2 minimum, you get early access to some of our great content. And if you want to find more of me, Dan, I play Apex over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Silu91. That's CYLOO91. I'll see you guys next time, right here.